In the world we live in right now, there are a ton of rivalries that press upon people a desire to go and take one side and vigorously defend the various attributes, personalities, successes, and so on of that one side. It can get quite violent at times. You might think we're talking about sports teams or that dumb Twilight feud, but there are rivalries that top those. We speak, of course, of Marvel versus DC Comics. Yes, the eternal comic book feud has been raging for decades, and it shows no signs of stopping. So allow us to show you 9 times the Marvel vs. DC rivalry turned ugly. Be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Number 9. The Death Battle Streaks. If you don't know about Death Battle, you should really look it up. In short, it's an internet show that uses real science, math, and more to determine who would win in versus matches. And as you can imagine, their best videos are often Marvel vs. DC matches. They've done Batman vs. Spider-Man, Lobo vs. Ghost Rider, Green Arrow vs. Hawkeye, Flash vs. Quicksilver, Wonder Woman vs. Thor, and so on and so forth. But as fans do, they tend to overreact at times. For example, when Marvel was winning the majority of the matchups based on the analysis, the DC fans said that the Death Battle team was biased, when that wasn't the case. Then, DC Comics characters got a long streak of wins because of the matches given, and so Marvel fans cried foul because clearly the Death Battle team were DC fanboys. Can you see the problem here? Death Battle doesn't do bias, as it would ruin the integrity of the show, but that doesn't stop people from blasting them if their character doesn't win. Number 8. The Captain Marvel Battle. Let's rewind to the earliest days in comics. By the 1940s, one superhero was shining above all others in sales. No, not Batman, or even Superman. Rather, it was Captain Marvel, made by Fawcett Comics. Captain Marvel and his family were a hit with readers. But DC Comics didn't like how similar he was to Superman, so they sued Fawcett. So much that they went out of business and DC Comics bought the rights to the Marvel family. However, it took a long time for everything to work out, so Marvel went and made their own Captain Marvel character. This led to a fierce standoff between the two, as one technically had the name rights, but the other one had an original character. Eventually, a compromise was worked out where Marvel could still use the name and DC Comics just rebranded the character as Shazam, though they could still call him Captain Marvel in the comics themselves, just not name the comic that. The name rights is often referenced in both sides, especially where the multiverse is concerned. Oh, and Death Battle did this battle too. Number 7. Stan Lee. Stan Lee is arguably one of, if not the, ultimate legend in the comic industry. He's the man that made Marvel Comics popular by making Hulk, Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, Black Panther, and more. But he was never afraid to be outspoken when the issue arose, especially when it came to the rivalry between Marvel and DC, including saying that Marvel was for intelligent people and that DC Comics copied their characters a lot. We don't resent competition. Indeed, we welcome it, but we do resent shabby, carelessly produced, badly written and drawn, conscienceless imitations of our Marvel mags, imitations which are callously lacking in quality and which are produced for the sole purpose of making a fast profit. While it's true that DC has copied Marvel in the past, so too has Marvel copied DC. That's how you got Deadpool, Hawkeye, Black Cat, and more. Number 6. Jack Kirby versus Stan Lee. Another major rivalry in the world of comics was that of Jack Kirby versus Stan Lee. The two were legendary friends and made a lot of comics together. But as fame and fortune grew for them both, Kirby said that Lee stole credit for their combined creations, and thus, he left for DC Comics. The illustrator took out his frustration on Marvel and Lee by brutally parodying them in a title he was working on for DC, Mr. Miracle. In issue number 6, he depicted Marvel as a former slave plantation run by a money-hungry villain called Funky Flashman, who bore an uncanny resemblance to his former collaborator. Apparently, after this happened, Stan Lee changed his look so that he would not look like Funky Flashman. It should be noted that many Jack Kirby creations became a staple for DC Comics, including Fourth World, Mr. Miracle, Darkseid, and so on. Number 5. The failed crossover. Comic history fans will know that one of the biggest things to ever happen in comics was when DC Comics and Marvel Comics came together for a genre-defining crossover, where the characters of both sides would fight each other, with fans choosing the winners, and then come together to save the day and offhandedly prove which universe was better. Hint, the message was both were great. But here's the thing, the crossover was supposed to happen a decade or so before. In fact, in the 70s and 80s, both sides had their characters crossover for small stints, including Superman and Spider-Man teaming up and Batman and Hulk meeting. By 1983, a crossover was planned with an all-star squadron. See what I did there? Planned to make it happen, but then it didn't. Both sides blamed the other for the incidents, so much so that they put it in the comics that the other universe was to blame for not teaming up. Yes, they did eventually work it out, but it took a while. Number 4. Directors and actors spitting shade. The Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DCEU are easily two of the biggest things in Hollywood right now, and if it weren't for 2020, films like Black Widow and Wonder Woman would have easily gotten $1 billion at the box office. However, while each side has their pluses and minuses, the actors and directors sometimes take things too far. For example, David Ayer made the divisive Suicide Squad film and during its New York premiere said "F Marvel" to a raucous crowd. He later apologized, but the comment stood. Then there was Anthony Mackie, who plays Falcon in the MCU. At one point in time, Captain America: Civil War and Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice was set to arrive on the same day. Mackie spit shade, though, when BVS moved to an earlier spot in the year, and Mackie noted, "They blinked first." Good fun? Yeah, but these weren't the only times this happened, showing that the feud goes beyond even the most basic and diehard of fans. Number 3. The copycat stories. We already noted before that Marvel and DC Comics have not been shy about copying each other's characters in the past. But what gets ugly at times is that they sometimes go all out and try and mimic each other's storylines and major arcs. A recent example of this came in Batman and X-Men. When both Marvel and DC Comics were planning the wedding of the century with their characters, Batman, Catwoman, and Colossus, Kitty Pryde, and not so ironically, they both ended in tragedy. There were also major events that were done to try and mimic one another and outdo one another. Or how about how two legendary sidekicks in Jason Todd and Bucky Barnes just so happened to get resurrected around the same time? Exactly. Imitation may be the sincerest form of flattery, but there's a limit. Number 2. Wonder Woman. Yes, I know we just talked about copycats, but this one is different. You see, Marvel was doing their now legendary arc called House of M, in which they introduced a character known as Wonder Man. Get it? Add a few letters and you get an Amazon warrior. Oh yeah, DC Comics was furious, and they personally asked Stan Lee to kill him off. They did, but then DC Comics turned around and made Power Girl, another ripoff and then some. And Marvel was so furious about this that Wonder Man was resurrected and is still around to this day. Though, to be fair, his character was given some personality traits to ensure that the name was the only thing linking him to the legendary Amazon. Number 1. The Fan Wars. We've hinted at it throughout this list, but if you really want to look at how ugly it can get between DC Comics and Marvel Comics in terms of their rivalry, look at the fans. The fans are the heart and soul of the universes, no doubt, but their loyalty and love for these stories and characters leads them to do things that are just terrible. The movies and TV shows are the best examples of this, as they'll go and constantly compare the two universes' outputs in these realms and get visceral when it comes to who won and why one is better. Sometimes they'll go and say revenue is more important, or critical acclaim, or use another factor to try and claim dominance, and it just doesn't end. Both sides have pluses, and both sides have minuses. Both sides have made billions of dollars at the box office, have won Oscars, been nominated for Emmys and other TV awards, and so on and so forth. They could just be happy with what they have. Instead, they constantly fight the other side to try and secure dominance. And yeah, It's sad and ugly. So what do you think? What do you think of this look at Marvel vs. DC and how things have turned out for them over the decades? Can you believe how deep and personal it got over the years with shots from fans, writers, actors, and even the publishers themselves? What do you think was the ugliest move? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the channel.